Are you going to run this, or do you need it?
What's that? Yep. Oh, perfect.
Wow, is he tall. Hi. I am so excited to be here today. I don't know if you guys realize this, but America is at a crossroads. Our founding fathers and the pilgrims before them knew that people have to agree on the same set of moral principles in order for our society to exist the way that we knew it. If we don't all agree on the rules, then the police have to enforce them. And the more that we disagree, the more the police are going to have to enforce any level of society that we have. And you can see day after day after day where we're at right now, where our police are getting shot sitting in their cars. Chaos is about to reign, and unless Christians start to take a voice in this, we're going to lose the control that we have. I think it's really important that you understand how much Christians have had an effect on this, and understand that I'm not asking for a theocracy, but I'm asking for Christians to step up. It is a huge burden on my heart and soul that we have to have Christians be a voice in the government. It starts with our history, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that later. I want you to understand how much it has changed since our founding, how much the telling of it has changed since our founding, and how Christians acting in the political sphere is not only allowable, but absolutely essential. We can no longer sit home. We are where we are because Christians have sat home in the past. So it's important that you understand that our founders didn't intend government by professional governors. So I'm going to let Pastor Colbeck introduce himself and a little bit of his history. He's not a professional governor. I'm not a professional governor either, and I think it's important that you understand that that regular folks can be here and do this.
Is this live? Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you very much. And by the way, I want to tell everybody what an honor it is to be up here with Representative Theis. For those of you who live in this area, she is your representative up in Lansing, and she is one of those deep thinkers that's faith-based. That's exactly the type of representative that I'm looking for personally up in Lansing, and I want to make sure you guys understand how blessed you are to have somebody like her up there. And I also want to thank Pastor Toma for, despite coming up here last year at this event speaking, he actually invited me back. So thank you very much, Pastor Toma. It's an honor to come up here. And I also want to thank Jennifer, because I know, Pastor Toma is talking about a lot of difficult subjects here. And I know my wife Angie over here, when people are attacking or saying bad things about the husband, it's doubly as hard on the wife. So please, we owe a big debt of thank you to Jennifer here as well. It's kind of listening to Pastor Toma in his introduction, I hope everybody understands what's really going on right now in the world. I mean, I'm sure we do, but I want to put it in a little bit finer point. You realize at the same time that Pastor Toma is being told, you can't talk about political issues, you can't talk about secular issues, you can't talk about world issues from the pulpit, Lana and I are being told we can't talk about spiritual issues, we can't talk about faith issues from the podium out in the Senate floor or the House floor, or in any of our appearances. The common denominator is they don't want to hear this, and there's folks that are attempting to silence us in the public square. That is why I'm such a big fan of this event, and the idea that we can talk about the merging of the body of Christ and the public square. It is essentially important. It's very important that you're here. Hopefully we'll have some things to share today that you can go off and be more bold in your community, because you're going to be armed with some information that you may not have come in with coming from this presentation. So there's a lot of stuff we're going to be trying to go through, but I hope it's a blessing to you and your family and our communities. So I just want to give a quick overview of where we're trying to head on our presentation today. First of all, Ilana's going to give a good overview of our religious heritage, so kind of set the foundation for the talk. Then I'm going to try to tackle something called Why Does Religious Liberty Even Matter? And we're going to talk about this schism, this political divide between social issues and economic issues. And then we're going to go through some of these social issues specifically, and then open it up for some Q&A and also kind of a charge for action, if you will. So if you guys are thinking it's just going to be about sitting down in the seats here, well, we're going to try to get you up and moving here, all right? So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'm going to hand things off to Representative Lana Theis.
I tend to be tied a little bit more to the podium. So my degree's in biology and chemistry. I was pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor, and God had different plans. I found out I was pregnant with our son and went back to my hubby, and I said, we got to put that dream on the shelf. I don't think I can be a good student and a good mom at the same time. And he said, let's do that. So I went home, raised the kids, and then started listening to talk radio and got involved in politics. So I decided that I was going to help. I had 2 kids at home. I was going to do my best. So I volunteered at the Victory Center. I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to really help you guys out. I got 2 hours a week, and I'm not going to make any phone calls, and I'm not going to knock any doors. I really don't want to talk to any people. So what I'll do is you can send me your information, and I'll do 2 hours a week of data entry, and you're welcome. And what happened is God. Within a month or so, I was running the Victory Center. I was working about 18 hours a day. My church, God bless them, they treated my family as if I was absent. So they were bringing meals, they were picking up my kids and moving them around, taking care of my hubby, making sure everything was okay. And fortunately, we won that election. That was back in 2004. And then I came home expecting to be a full-time mom again. And then my township passed a tree ordinance that was going to cost me $40,000 before I could start adding on to my home. And that was not okay with me. I don't have a spare $40,000. I don't know about you guys, but I don't. So I decided to fight it. I put my kids in a wagon and I went door to door. We had a referendum petition, and by the end of that, we won almost 2/3 of that vote. A mom with 2 kids and a wagon and a pen with no phone, by the way. I don't say that to tell you how awesome I am. I say that to tell you how awesome God is and how incredible this country is and how much one person can fundamentally change things, and I'm begging you to get involved with that. This is just, I'm not... So you're going to be shocked, but George Washington was a bit of a religious guy. It is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God and the Bible. How many of you agree with that? And here's where we are today. In spite of our religious freedom, our First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I just pulled these off the internet. I went for a quick run. So we've got an Oregon bakery that's having to pay $135,000 because they wouldn't bake a cake that was in violation of the religious principles. We've got a Christian school at a football game that is being prohibited from praying. We've got the Michigan statewide school board approving an LGBTQ policy that says that boys are going to be in the girls' locker rooms. We've got a Texas judge under fire for praying in the courtroom in spite of the fact that our legislatures throughout the country pray before they start their sessions. Our U.S. Supreme Court prays before they start. We're being lied to. So 1 Timothy 2 says, first of all, pray for our leaders in authority. First of all, it is the priority. He didn't say first pray for your kids. First of all, pray for our leaders in authority. God tells us that it should be a priority. Beyond that, we've got an awful lot of evidence of history in the Bible where people are interacting with their government. So Luke 18, my pastor was talking about this just last week, how convenient, like God, right? The unrighteous judge and the persistent widow. So the judge, by his own words, doesn't care about God, doesn't care about the people. He's just a government official. That kind of sounds familiar to me. And then we have a persistent widow. The widow is in society at that time. She had absolutely no credibility. She had no power. She had nobody on her side. But she went to him for justice. And it got to a point where he was so bothered by her persistence that it actually became easier for him to do the right thing than for him to ignore her. Righteous people speaking to government, even when they're not righteous, cause righteous things to happen. I think that's God telling us we need to interact. Now, this is George Orwell, and while I agree he's not exactly a theologian, he who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. What he's telling us is that the people who are writing our history books are telling us what happened historically, and they're lying to us. But that lie is allowing them to control what we're seeing in the future, and allowing a lot of the lies that are happening in society, where you hear things like America doesn't have Christian roots. It wasn't born as a Judeo-Christian nation. It was born of Judeo-Christian worldview. And while you want to argue some of the other things, I don't think that history plays that out. So the colonization of North America was started basically as a whole bunch of church replants. You have the Puritans coming for religious liberty, and I got to read you their compact. So this is a very secular document. So what happened is the Puritans come in, they're going to land, they find out that they're way north of where they're supposed to be. So there's no law governing them. So before they even get off the boat, they make a compact, and by the way, it was called the Plymouth Combination at the time. It starts out, "In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, Ireland, King, defender of the faith," etc. But then they go on, "having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith." And then they mention, "and for the honor of our king and country." Does that sound like a secular document to you? The Anglicans came for religious liberty. The Quakers came for religious liberty. And those are the mindsets and the heritage of the men that were our founding fathers. So they're signing the Plymouth Combination. Here we are. Declaration of Independence. Not a Christian document either, right? Yes, it is. Absolutely it is. 3 aspects of God's nature are represented in the Declaration. While relying on the protection of divine providence, we declared our independence, stating within that document that God is our creator, is the one who endowed us with inalienable rights. He is described in the last paragraph as the supreme judge of the world. He is the executive. He is the legislative. And he is the judge. So they took those things and they created a government for us. It further states that the purpose of government is to secure these rights, the rights that were endowed to us by God. How many of you heard of the Black-Robed Regiment? Well, I got a couple. They were a major change to the force of the Revolutionary War. Pictured off to the left is the Reverend Muhlenberg. And he was quoting Ecclesiastes 3 when he said that there was a time for everything, including a time to fight. And he pulled off his robes, and underneath was his officer's garb, and he took his entire congregation off to war. That happened again and again. How many of you have heard Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, "The British are coming, the British are coming"? Do you know where he was going? I don't ever remember being taught that. He was going to a pastor's house. Minister Jonas Clark had Sam Adams and John Hancock staying at his house. They had committed treason under the crown. So the British were coming to take them. So do you know what Adams and Hancock said to him? "Is your congregation ready?" It was assumed that he would have taught his congregation how to fight. His response was, "Yep, they sure are." I'm paraphrasing. It's actually kind of a funny story. So they go racing over to where the church is, they ring the bell, everybody shows up with their muskets and everything, ready to fight, and then there were no British. So then they all went home, and then they went back to bed, and the bell rings again, they come back, and then they actually fight. So Benjamin Franklin, at our Constitutional Convention, arguably the least religious, his prayer at the convention, he says, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if sparrows cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build this house, they labor in vain that build it." And he goes on to say, we have to pray before any time we open this up. And that prayer, his advice, is why my legislature opens with a prayer every day. So one of the first things our Congress did when we built our new Capitol building, decide that we were going to have church in the Capitol. Does that sound like a separation of church and state as we understand it to you? For many, many decades, it was actually a mega church, so it was happening in the representatives' house, and it was packed. They were supposed to have hundreds of people there. They had closer to 1,000. It was definitively a mega church at the time. So the problems that we have right now is that our schools are not teaching historic truth, and I believe we've lost the battle, but we've not lost the war, and I'm not willing to give that up. We must teach the truth of our heritage. The Northwest Ordinance, 1787, same time as our Constitution. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So our schools are not only to teach knowledge, but they are to teach religion and morality. Noah Webster said, "The education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention. It is much easier to introduce and establish an effectual citizen than to correct by penal statute the ill effects of the bad citizen. The education of youth lays the foundation on which both law and gospel rest." Do you guys see the marriage of the Christian idea, the Christian biblical worldview, and our civil society, and how essential it is that we are speaking to those things? I'm not asking for a theology. I'm asking for a Christian voice. When we're allowing the world to tell us that we cannot pray, and yet God has given us the power to vote for leaders that will allow that to happen, to become the leaders that will allow that to happen. We need to do that. I hear a lot of Christians saying, I don't get involved in politics, but we're charged with electing our leadership. In Samuel, the judges were how things were governed. The people came to him and said, "Nah, we want kings." I'm paraphrasing again. Sam said, "No, don't think that's a good idea. You really want the judges." But God gave them the monarchy that they requested. God gave them the government that they requested, in spite of the fact that that wasn't what he was recommending for them. We send missionaries. We tithe. We know that it's absolutely essential that we interact in the realm. But we don't throw the money in the air and expect the angels to come down and grab the money and distribute it accordingly. We send out missionaries. I'm telling you, the political realm is a mission field, and we need you. I'm going to turn it over now.
All right, now you guys see why it's such a blessing to have her up in Lansing, working on our behalf. All right, for those of you who don't know my background, going to Lansing is probably one of the last things I ever wanted to do. For me, it was a call of faith. I'm actually an aerospace engineer, so if you see some, dependency upon slides, and Lana likes to chide me for my trying to drill down into facts and figures and spreadsheets and stuff like that, that's kind of where it comes from. But I kind of took this as a call. My wife and I both prayed about whether or not we were being called to go off and serve in public office, and the message we got from God was pretty clear. It was either go to Nineveh or get swallowed by a big fish. So we decided to go to Nineveh, and we're doing our best up there to make sure that we highlight the truth of not only God's Word, but the truth of what's actually happening up in Lansing on a regular basis. And it's great to have allies like Lana helping in that pursuit. So I'm going to take on, Lana put together a kind of a backdrop of our religious heritage. And I'm going to try to take on the challenge of saying, well, why does that even matter? And we're going to start off with just a quick little observation. As Christians, we're very sensitive to the idea of poverty across the world, right? We want to make sure that everybody is taken care of. We're all God's children. But I want to make sure everybody understands there's a distinct difference between the poverty you see in areas where they haven't had a firm foundation of a Christian government and those countries where there is poverty, but we do have that Christian foundation. There's a serious difference. I also want to kind of talk about the idea of when you're talking about overall prosperity, not just hunger, but also talking about what's the difference between a nation that's founded on Christian principles and of which the United States is the only one that's been solidly founded on Christian principles. There's a difference. For 5,000 years, we were just a barter trade society. So in other words, I only trust you as far as what I saw you trying to trade with me in a barter trade arrangement. Under Christian values, this whole idea of trust starts coming up. And if you've ever read the book, how many people have read the book, The 5,000-Year Leap by Cleon Skousen? If you haven't read it, please put it on your reading list because it kind of explains this jump from barter trade to a society where we've got multiple interactions that involve serious trust, where people are handing over money, they're handing over time, in an atmosphere of trust that somewhere down the road they're actually going to get something out of something of benefit. Not just to them, but maybe a society as a whole. So in one society or in one economic system, you're just exchanging grapes for kumquats. And the other one, we're building airplanes, which is near and dear to my heart as an aerospace engineer, and we're putting people up on the moon. There's a big difference. So, despite this observation, despite our Christian heritage, how many of you have ever heard people say that people need to be focused on economic issues and that we shouldn't be talking about any of the social issues we're going to be talking about today? How many of you find that kind of frustrating? Well, the goal of today, what I'm trying to do is kind of put in some backdrop that's going to help you maybe explain why social issues are extremely important. We didn't get the United States before we started talking about social issues. It was social issues that drove, as Lana pointed out with the Mayflower Compact, it drove people to come over to the United States and start a new land, and start a new civilization, start a new government. And it's important that we realize that connection. I'm going to try to make that connection very clear here in a little bit. But there's a lot of stuff that that are very important to us socially that nobody ever wants to talk about. As a matter of fact, in our state government right now, it's very rare that you see any legislation talking about social issues popping up into the visor here, and it's almost all on economic issues. And for me personally, I find that very frustrating. So, but that's a facet of people that are trying to silence the discussion of the social issues in deference to economic issues, but they're connected. But let's start off with the concept of the greatest tome probably ever on the free market, called Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Another quiz on what you've been reading. How many of you have been instructed in or have read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations? Alrighty. How many of you have never heard of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations? Alrighty. Well, Adam Smith was probably the world's first serious economist, if you will, and tried to describe via observation. He was observing societies and markets in his area of Scotland where he was growing up. And he wrote those observations down in a book called The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he talks all about topics that a lot of the legislation that's going through Michigan right now talks about. So things like division of labor. We get into all kinds of bills that are dealing with new classifications of labor. Talks about the origin of money. It talks about nature and market practices, and he talks about how wages are determined. I mean, he goes into it and starts talking about when you get into a division of labor, he'll go off and explain that it was based on manufacturing of a pin is one of the examples that he provided. And he highlighted that some companies will just go off and say everybody has to build a pin from scratch from the beginning all the way to the end, and you just kind of have everybody in their own little pin development stalls and they go off and build them. And he said, no, we want to start subdividing the labor. Some people will be straightening the pin, some people will be putting the head on the pin, and it allowed for a lot more efficiencies and more productivity. And what he found was a lot of people would, some people, if everybody got paid equally building the pin for different ones, everybody would take the easiest part of the manufacturing process and nobody would go on and take on the difficult one. So it started getting into the idea of different scales of wages that were associated with it as well. So it's one of those documents it's really just common sense put into a book. It's just observing the way life actually operates, and he put it into a book. Well, one of the really sad things about what's going on in our education system, especially in our universities, is that I have a cousin of mine that I'm exceedingly proud of. He's one of the nicest gentlemen you'd ever want to meet in your whole life. And he went into teaching, but when he was at the University of Michigan, my alma mater and where I met my wife Angie, he was an economics and history major. And you know how many times he got to read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations when he was out at the University of Michigan? Yeah, the goose eggs are right. Do you know how many times he had to do a paper on Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto? Yeah, at least 3 times that he remembers. So we're kind of losing an appreciation for this. That's why there weren't too many hands that were put up there. But it's very important that people understand that this was done basically on observations. The guy did not have a political bent on this. He didn't have a political angle on it. He just said, here are my notes, here's what I've observed, and here's what's going on. If you haven't heard too much about Wealth of Nations, you probably haven't heard about this. Ever hear of the theory of moral sentiments? That's actually what Adam Smith wrote before he wrote Wealth of Nations, and it was focused on social issues. It was trying to identify what motivates different behaviors in society. And once again, it was very observational. And I just want to highlight a couple different texts, because he kind of frames the big debate we're at when it comes to economic systems and in many respects, government systems. On one hand, he highlights that there's a big dependency on benevolence and kindness in transactions. When you're actually going off and being somebody in the marketplace, you're actually you should have the mindset, if you want to be successful, you're going to go off and try to do something that's of value for your customer, right? So you've got this altruistic bent that, it's tough to sell stuff on the free market if you don't have the best interest of the person you're trying to sell to at heart. Sooner or later, you're going to be found out for being a shyster on it, and nobody's going to go off and buy stuff from you. On the other hand, there's a whole bunch of folks that think that they can manage from above, that life is a big chess game. And he called it the man of the system, if you will. How many of you guys have ever heard of a video game called Sim City? Well, I can tell you there's a lot of people in government that think that they're running a Sim City and you're all the little minions that they're moving around on the board here in that simulation game. And Adam Smith framed that difference in social motivations and kind of and difference between whether or not an individual could make their own decisions about what's in their best self-interest and would be motivated by self-interest versus the state coming down and saying, top down, here's what you need to be doing in order to fulfill my a utopian vision of how the world should operate. So, first of all, I want to highlight that already in our history around economic systems, we have a tie between economic issues in the Wealth of Nations, and we got a tie between social issues over in the theory of moral sentiment by the father of modern economics, Adam Smith. All right, but let's go into some detail on different types of transactions to kind of put a finer point on this, if you will. There's a congressman from Ohio, his name is Bob McEwen, that is very good at distilling complex subjects into very simple talking points. And I'm going to do my best to reflect his approach on describing different types of transactions or economic transactions And he uses something called first person, second person, third person breakout to describe the differences in the types of transactions we see in society. And a first person transaction is pretty clear. It's when I go off and buy something for myself, right? A second person transaction is when maybe I go buy something for someone else for their birthday, somebody that's near and dear to me. Third party transaction, or a third person transaction, is when I use somebody else's money to buy something for somebody else. All right? Does that make sense to everybody? So there are 3 different types of transactions. All right, well, let's look at what the differences are from a cost perspective. So if you want to minimize the cost of a certain transaction, first person transaction, I'm going to be very concerned with cost because I only got so much money in my wallet. Actually, I got no money in my wallet today, but I only got so much money in my wallet, and so I want to make sure I'm getting really good value. Second person, yeah, cost is pretty important too. I don't want to break the bank if I'm going off and buying a gift for somebody. But a third person, hey, it's somebody else's money. I don't care at all about the cost, right? How about quality? Well, if I'm buying it for myself, I really want to get the best merchandise, best service, best product that I can receive for that money. If I'm second person, well, I don't know if it's really the thought that counts. And when I give somebody a gift, I might be pretty close with it. I might not hit it exactly right, but that's what regifting's all about, right? Well, on a third-person transaction, I don't care about cost, and I don't really care about quality. All I care about is somebody told me to go off and do this, I'm going to go off and do it, right? Well, let's start talking about that need for humanity and benevolence that we were talking about in the theory of moral sentiments. Well, in a first-person transaction, well, I'm not really dependent a heck of a lot on that. I mean, if it's something I need, it's something I need. And it's not like I have to trust anybody else. I'm the one that's controlling the whole transaction. When you get into a second-person transaction, well, there's a little bit of trust involved there. It's trust that the person receiving this gift is actually going to appreciate it and that you're actually trying at least to think about what's in their best interest. But in a third-party transaction, if you don't have people that are altruistic, that are thinking in your best interest, then you're going to have a pretty high cost associated with it, and you're not going to really have somebody that cares a heck of a lot about quality. You know what the problem with these transaction models are? What the biggest issue is? That all government transactions are third-party transactions. And so when we start talking about social versus economic issues, what happens when you have a whole bunch of folks in government that are a bunch of crooks looking out for their own skin and not looking out for other people? You get high costs for everything and you get low quality. They're focused on their own skins, their own jobs, their own to-do lists, if you will, and not necessarily people they're supposed to serve. Conversely, if you have people of good character that are not subject to bribes, they're going to represent your best interests. Now, the society we have today doesn't necessarily have a lot of those folks, right? Which is another reason why, and more part of the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, is that they preached the concept of a limited government, right? And so if you have a limited government, you're not as dependent upon everything we're talking about here. But we're not in a limited government mindset, either in the state of Michigan or in the federal government today. So John Adams, in his wisdom, said that our Constitution that we've established is made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly unsuited to the governance of any other. And now you can see why that's the case. If you've got expanded freedom, it's depending upon people that are honorable to go off and execute those freedoms in a responsible way. So I want to highlight, we've talked about the university system right now, but it's something that we're involved in. David Coleman is sitting in the back with the Great Lakes Justice Center, has been helping me out on this. But the front line of all that we are talking about right now, and it kind of gets to the heart of Representative Theis' discussion around George Orwell, is education. And there's a lot of stuff going on in education right now that is concerning. And having you here today is actually great because this is kind of a mini education seminar, or that's what the intent is with this information. So the goal is to give you information to go back out into the community, back out into the school boards, back out into the classrooms, back out in the public square and start talking about key issues that other folks are trying to suppress. So, and why is this important? Because the philosophy of education in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Abraham Lincoln nailed that. And that's what's happening right now in our society. You have any wonder why a socialist could be leading on the Democratic ticket and win our state here in Michigan? It's because people have not been taught what socialism actually does. They haven't been taught things like the fact that the Nazi Party stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. People need to understand the truth, and that's being suppressed. So there's a lot of different activities. Some of them we're going to be going over here in more depth in just a second here. But how many of you guys have heard of Common Core education standards? Yeah, I've got a bill to repeal that and replace it with some... Thanks. It's kind of... The way to look at that is the folks that are interested in that SimCity mindset that we were talking about before, those are the folks who are trying to implement Common Core across the board. And it's, by the way, that spans Republican and Democrat lines. These are the folks that think they know more than everybody else. Get into civics and history, and that's what we've been working on with Dave Coleman and Judge Warren and James Muffett out of Citizen Traditional Values. We're actually, the new social studies standards that have been proposed by the State Board of Education, I got together with other legislators like Representative Theis, and we submitted a list of revisions that had to be made in order to ensure that these standards are politically neutral and accurate. So, and I'm happy to say that we've had some great discussions with educators that put together those original standards, and it looks like we may get 15 out of 15 of our revisions embedded in some way, shape, or form in the updated standards, and we'll find out for sure next week. And you know what the difference is? We spoke up. We didn't stay silent. We said, this is wrong. It's time to go off and live the 2 Timothy 1:7 guidance that says, do not be timid, do not be afraid, but express yourself in a spirit of power and love and self-control, and that's exactly what we did. We simply had two criteria. It said, make it politically neutral and make it accurate, and we had great discussions with all those folks, and I love everybody we're working with on that, and before it had been kind of an adversarial relationship, but it works. So now we're going to delve into some details here. Now, strap on your political sensitivity vest here. We're going to attempt to go off and address some thorny little social issues, and the intent on each of these issues is to kind of present a biblical view. So what does God's Word say about this issue? And then what does the world typically say about it? And I could pick a lot of different biblical phrases, biblical extracts on this and provisions. I've only picked one on each one of them, but I just want to kind of highlight this as a framework for discussion. The key thing I'd encourage each and every one of you to do is to go off and make sure you're reading the Bible so you can get a better understanding of everything we're talking about in a biblical world context. All you have to do is listen to the news if you want to get the worldly view, right? Or read the newspaper, that kind of stuff. So, first issue, and this is where Lana and I are going to be getting a little bit more a tag team here. First issue is that good old separation of church and state, right? Now, you guys have all heard that, and this is, for this audience, I bet you I know most of you guys are going to get this answer, but can somebody tell me where you can find the word separation of church and state in this Constitution? Is it because it's written in a different language? That's why you can't find it? Or it's not in here, guys. Lana showed what the First Amendment said. That was very clear. And just one of the quotes, it talks about the fact that the Bible talks about there is a relationship between our government and God, and it is blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. You guys have all heard that psalm. There's a lot of other passages in the Bible, but what we're told in the worldly view is that we have freedom from religion, not freedom of religion.
So the letter to the Danbury Baptists, that's what was happening. And what was being spoken to at that point is that the federal government wasn't going to attempt to control the state's interaction with the church and wasn't going to insist that the state take on a church that was different from what the Danbury Baptists were looking for. If you read the entire document, you will find that it says exactly, and I know you're going to be shocked by this, exactly the opposite of how it's being interpreted today. You guys all look shocked.
All right, so anytime somebody says separation of church and state, you know that's bogus, right? And this is not saying that we're going to enforce the Christian religion upon everybody. It's just saying that I have a faith perspective on it, and all the incidents or examples that Lana showed before means that I have a right, a protected right to religious conscience. It means you're not supposed to be forcing me to have a perspective that conflicts with that conscience. I just posted up today an observation. Am I the only one that believes that tolerance is being redefined as forced acceptance nowadays? All right, next social issue. Abortion. And my favorite passage in the Bible puts clear, there's a lot of different passages in the Bible I could go into around the topic of life in the womb, but the one that really tugs at my heart is when Mary visited Elizabeth, right after Mary had conceived, and Elizabeth has John the Baptist in her womb, and he leapt for joy when Mary came by. Well, that's, usually non-viable tissue masses don't really leap too much. So I think that for me that was very clear, saying, no, God is there with you. You are a human being when you were in the womb. But today, the baby in the womb is being treated as a medical condition and something that needs to be corrected.
So I've had this conversation. I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine that I knew had had an abortion. And she said, why are you guys so concerned about controlling what's going on in my body anyway? And so I said, well, okay, let's just take this to a real life scenario. You're looking over at your neighbor's house and you see them beating on their 2-year-old. Do you feel a duty to act? And she said, well, of course I do. I said, okay, well, never mind. It's not a 2-year-old. The baby's a month old. Still have a duty to act? She goes, well, of course. I said, all right. It was a preemie. The baby was born 3 months premature, has just now made it so that they know that the baby's going to survive, but they're beating the child. Do you still have a duty to act? And she goes, well, of course you do. And I said, why? At what point did it become a baby? And her eyes got kind of wide, and I said, what you're discussing with me is not a matter of humanity, it's geography. And that's a very different thing. And we as Christians feel a huge obligation to make sure that we're protecting humanity.
All right, here's the one that's front and center in a lot of discussions today, and there's no quicker way to earn an editorial from the Free Press calling you a bigot than to go off and speak out on this particular topic, even if you're simply stating that you don't believe that the policies coming out of the State Board of Education are safe and supportive for the kids in our schools. So the biblical worldview, and this is one of the things that's most concerning to me, is a lot of people get into, I can quote Leviticus 20:13, 18:22, I can talk about Deuteronomy 22:5, about men, women wearing women's clothes, but we're not going to get into that. The thing that concerns me most as a Christian is this phrase right here, and it gets to the heart of what Pastor Toma was talking about the 2 kingdoms, is that those who practice homosexuality shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And so if we as Christians are saying, hey, it's all right, it's just do whatever you want to go off and do, do whatever you feel is right, well, we're selling them short if we don't go off in love and make sure that they understand that, no, God's word says that you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. You may choose to ignore that, but it's our obligation to make sure you're aware of the fact that that's not God's model for life, and the challenge for us as Christians is that too many people, including people that are professing Christians, are in this mode of operating where they give all love and no truth. And then there's a lot of folks, frankly, on the other side that come across very mean-spirited, if you will, that are all truth and no love. And our challenge in our Christian walk is to make sure that we're conveying truth in love. It ain't easy, especially when people are calling you everything under the sun and getting your dander up, and it can be a struggle. But the worldly view, and this is where it gets to the heart of this, and I've sat in Senate Education Policy Committee hearings where people have made this case, is that, and by the way, in our social studies standards, they're making the case for LGBTQ rights as being a civil right up there with, the right to vote, the right to the right for no discrimination in regards to race or sex. They're putting it right up there and right up next to the right of religious conscience. And what we worked on in the social studies standards, saying, all right, if you guys want to talk about that, I know it's in public discussion, we can put it in there, but you better have a section on religious conscience, and you better talk about how this perceived right over here is in conflict with many people's religious conscience. And that's what this gets to the heart of it. They're turning into a civil rights debate, but I just want to make sure that we know the biblical truths going into that.
So I've recruited the help of some of my my family members. Please welcome Sam and Gabrielle, my husband and daughter.
Give her enough.
Hey Dad, I'm home.
Hey honey, how was your day?
Well, I'm really worried. There's boys in my locker room and I don't know why they're there.
Honey, those aren't boys. Those are girls. They identify inside how they feel as like a girl.
But I feel really uncomfortable and unsafe around them. I haven't been showering at school because I just don't feel comfortable.
You know, that's very intolerant of you. That's how they see themselves on the inside. You know, they may look like a boy on the outside, but on the inside, they feel like they're a girl. And you should treat them as such.
But they're still biologically male.
Okay, you're bordering on bigotry now. They are girls, just like you're a girl.
Okay, so if on the inside I felt like I was a boy, would you accept me and treat me as if I was a boy?
Of course I would.
Okay, so if I not only felt like a boy, but if I felt like an Asian boy, would you accept me and treat me as such?
Yes I would, of course.
Okay. So if I felt like an Asian boy that was 6'5", would you still accept me and treat me like I was
Okay, so
that way?
you're not suddenly going to be able to reach items on the top shelf at the supermarket.
But Dad, that's how I feel on the inside.
Yes, I would accept you like that, of course.
Okay. So if I felt like a boy, Asian, and I was 6'5", not only all that, but I felt like I was an 80-year-old, 6'5" Asian boy, would you still accept me that way?
All right, now you're just being ridiculous. You're 15 years old. You're not suddenly going to be old enough to vote, buy booze and cigarettes, and join the military.
But how is that any different from feeling like a boy?
Thank you. Aren't they awesome? So how many of you found that you got uncomfortable with the boy standard But you could see where in society today, all right, I can understand why they're getting there. But then they got to Asian and you get a little bit offended because that's kind of a protected area. And then they get to height and you realize how there's no way, nobody would confuse her for that. And then she gets to old. Well, none of those were subjective standards. Every single one of those standards is objective. It is a true or false determination. And this is the lie that we're starting to buy in society today, and one of the major problems why we need the Christian voice speaking into the arena and calling for truth.
Yep. Kind of puts in perspective when Pilate said, "What is truth?" doesn't it? All right, social justice. Oh boy. There's a lot of, this is a topic that comes up quite a bit in faith circles in particular. And I found that if you ask 10 different people what they mean by social justice, you're going to get pretty much 10 different answers. But ultimately, we are called to go out into society. We are called to reflect God's light and be salt and light out in the world. And when we see injustice, we're supposed to speak out. I mean, that's kind of a sensitive issue. But now a lot of people, if you can see arbitrary truths or frankly ignorance of the truth in certain circumstances, like we just saw in that last skit, now if people rally around things that are just not true and that there is no necessarily injustice being done in a certain case, you can see where this can kind of unravel quite a bit. So ultimately it's backing up a worldview that says that the state's responsible for fixing economic and religious injustices without any regard to any universal principle of justice. And this is where that biblical foundation comes in place. God kind of outlines the idea of right and wrong very clearly, and that should be our measurement stick. A lot of people are putting in some false measurement sticks that are calling 15-year-old girls or 13-year-old girls 18-year-old Asian boys that are 6'5". And so we got to make sure that the justice is done on the right scale. So
social justice is something that's we all want a level playing field. That's one of the things that the government is responsible to do. But what our society today has interpreted, not a level playing field, but we're supposed to end up with a tie game. And that is not the intent of God. Had it been God's choice, He could have equally gifted all of us. We could all look exactly alike, we could all have exactly the same talents, and we could all have exactly the same income, and God did not choose it that way. It is not God's choice that we end up with a tie game.
All right, let's hit another real easy topic, right? All the people that are putting their fist up at the NFL football games right now. The fact of the matter is, as Christians, we are called not to show favoritism. Doesn't matter if you're a 6'5" guy who wants to be, or a girl who wants to be an Asian, or if you're different skin color, or whatever the case may be. We are called not to show favoritism, and this gets into some problems right now, because on the other side, on the world side, there's kind of some other topics that are going on that and you see it in context of a lot of the other issues. It's that justice now becomes a case of who you are rather than what you've done, and it's a slippery slope. And I think that's part of why this is such a contentious issue in today's society, is that there's so much focus on who is somebody's done in the criminal justice system instead of what, that it gets into a very dangerous area.
So one of the things that I, as a female in a largely male-dominated world, which is what I've tended to be everything I've done, I want to earn it. I don't want to give anybody else a reason to believe that because I'm female, I'm less capable. So we better not be promoting less capable females just because they happen to be female. That should be true for everybody and everything.
All right, environmental justice. You want to go on, if you want to go through any hall in any school, you're going to see everything about clean energy, and it's almost to the point where, I mean, and I'm all for the environment and taking care of the environment, especially in a biblical context. We're called to be good stewards of the earth. But some people are actually turning that into a worship of Mother Earth, if you will. And you guys remember the Asherah poles that you hear about in the Bible? You remember what those actually were? That was Mother Nature. That was a goddess. And actually, we're talking about the ELCA that Pastor Toma was talking about. There's actually a Pacific Synod in the ELCA that actively promotes worship of Asherah poles. And it's the goddess of... So, by the way, Angie and I used to be in the ELCA. We're not anymore. So there is a push, and we find this legislatively where people are actually promoting concepts that human population is actually a scourge upon the earth. That's not what God says. And then it's also saying that animals have rights that supersede human rights. We have legislation that comes up all the time on these matters, and it's kind of a scary little trend.
Let's not do that. Enough said.
All right, and the last social issue I want to talk about is how many times have you heard you shouldn't talk about anybody's private life when they go off and run for office? Character, virtue, that kind of stuff doesn't really matter. That's not what God says. And Exodus 18:21, I get a lot of people that ask me for endorsements, and this is a standard that I use for an endorsement. And I may vote for somebody if they don't do this, if they don't have these attributes, but I'm not going to endorse them. And in this context, God's looking for capable men and women, it's generic, that fear God, that are trustworthy and not subject to bribes. Wouldn't it be nice if all of our representatives set that standard? Alrighty, and now we're going to get into a little bit of a plan of action here. And I think some people got up and spoke about this before. And I want to kind of highlight that we've got an action plan for each and every one of us. First of all, let's start off with the understanding that elected officials are called representatives for a reason, right? So if our citizens, if the people who are voting do not have a biblical worldview, you're going to have some people serving you that aren't going to have that biblical worldview, right? Does that make sense? So just a quick action plan. My wife and I have gone to something called Good News Via de Cristo. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of that. It's like a walk of Emmaus or Cursillo. And in there we have kind of a 3-step plan that we go through. And it goes like this. Piety, which is prayerfully trying to listen to God, build that relationship, that one-on-one personal relationship with God. Devote time every single day for that purpose. Study. Get into God's Word, read it on a regular basis. It's not just something that you should be hearing once a week on Sunday. It's something that should guide your everyday steps. It's something that in the morning, I'm more likely to skip a shower than I am to skip my Bible reading in the morning. And also apostolic action, which is going off and being salt and light out into the community. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Lana.
So there's a lot of things up there, you guys can see the list, but where I got started, I hated history in high school. I thought it was the most boring thing on the planet. When I got involved in it and got involved in civics, oh my gosh, it was amazing. I actually truly loved my government class when I got to high school, and then promptly forgot all about it. But I was able last year to bring my high school government teacher on the House floor. He's 80, it was the first time. So study civics. If you haven't had a chance to do that, online.hillsdale.com. There is a lot of information available, just oodles of it, that will give you a lot of the history of our country. And while it's not coming directly from a biblical perspective, it is rooted in our biblical history. They understand, and we're started as a Christian college. Research the issues. You guys are going to be shocked by this too, the news is not always accurate. Make sure you're finding out the truth of what's going on. It is all available to you. The Michigan.gov has the legislative section on it. If there are bills coming through, you can actually click on and read the bills that are being considered. You can get onto a listserv so that those bills, when anything is moving on a particular topic, it will get emailed to you. I'll make sure that we have that information given to you later. It's kind of a long URL. Engage at school board meetings. We were just talking about how important the school boards are. They're teaching our kids things that are very different from reality. And they're considering questions like LGBTQ. They really are talking about it being okay for a boy to be in a girl's locker room if the boy feels like a girl. Well, how many 15-year-old boys do you know, if given a free pass to the girls' locker room, are not going to feel like a girl that day? It is illogical, and it's harmful to our kids. In my district, there was a group of kids that were third grade boy. Wouldn't go to the bathroom at school because he went in there once and there was a girl in there in the locker room or in the bathroom with him. So he would hold it all day and then hold it on the bus on the way home and be near tears, racing into the house trying to get to the bathroom because he didn't want to be that humiliated in the bathroom again. No child should have to go through that. I'm not saying that children that are having the difficulty should not be addressed, but there are individual bathrooms for that purpose. Not only engage at school board meetings, run for the school board. There aren't a ton of people that vote in the election that understand what the school boards do. They're handling huge budgets. They're making huge determinations about our children, the most important decisions happening in our culture. We need Christian voices there. Engage at city and township council meetings. It's kind of fun. I was a township treasurer. If we had 3 people at a meeting, we were nervous. There was something major going on. So when I got involved with the whole tree ordinance thing, I showed up with me and 50 of my friends. You should have seen their faces. It was awesome. Attend our elected officials' office hours. All of us make an opportunity for our citizens to be able to engage and discuss with us. You don't even have to go very far, and we'll buy your coffee. Make sure you show up at those. That information is also available online. I told you it's legislature.mi.gov to read the bills. It's not like DC where there's 1,000 pages. There's probably 3 pages, and then it's the bolded type that is the change. So that's what you need to pay attention to. Research the candidates. If you don't know that information, call your friends who you know are engaged. We'll get that to you. Support the candidates. Donate your time. Donate your money. This is an expensive proposition. We have candidates spending between $100,000 and $300,000 in the House races alone. It can get a lot more expensive than that. Congress is not unusual for it to run in the millions of dollars. And then letters to the editor. That's an easy way to get information out to everybody. If you can see all that information online.
Okay. Thanks, Lana. And I'm going to skip the Q&A. We're going to have a panel discussion later, and we're going to be around available to talk one-on-one in between here. But the last charge I want to leave everybody with is this from Ezekiel. You know, God's looking for intercessors, people that are going to stand in the gap. And I just want to challenge each and every one of you. I don't know what God's asking each and every one of you individually to do, but I ask you to prayerfully consider and listen to Him and see what He's calling you to do out in the public square. The purpose of today's meeting, the purpose of today's session is about talking about Christ in the public square. See where God's calling you into the public square. Thank you guys very much for your time.